All right, it's 4 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Thursday afternoon class. And so it's our second class session. So how's everyone doing today?
Good. Last
Good.
class of the week for me, so.
Good. Yeah, it's the last class of the week for me too. So we can end our week on a good note. Okay. Oops. A little bit too quickly there. All right, so the plan for today is we're going to do kind of like a crash course in cardiovascular anatomy and physiology today, okay? And so, we're going to be going over a lot of biological information, and, I know it's going to be kind of a really big information dump. And so, it's kind of a lot to take in at once, but, I kind of wanted to introduce all of this right now. And then, as we go out through this, as we go through the rest of the semester, when we talk about, some of the engineering concepts and fluid mechanical concepts, we'll refer back to these set of lecture notes and see how it all connects to a lot of the engineering that we're going to do. Okay, but today we kind of have to do, kind of before we start talking about anything cardiovascular, we have to learn about the anatomy and the physiology, or at least be introduced to it, or at least have those concepts, at least exposed to us. And so that's kind of my plan for the lecture today, is to kind of just do a little bit of shock therapy of a bunch of biological terms and vocabulary and concepts, just so that we can start talking about that stuff starting next week. Okay. All right. And so, are there any questions I can answer before we get started? Okay. All right. And so let's go ahead and get rolling. Okay. And so, the focus for this class is the cardiovascular system, right? And so I think everyone knows that in this class. And just like we talked about on Tuesday, when people talk about the cardiovascular system, what they're referring to is your heart, your blood vessels, and the blood itself inside the human body. Okay. And just like we talked about on Tuesday as well, the primary role of the cardiovascular system is to be a way for your body to transport things, from one part of your body to the next. Okay. And so some things that your body needs to transport are things like oxygen, things like nutrients, enzymes, hormones, and even heat. Okay. So all of that gets transported through the cardiovascular system. So it's a very centrally important system in your body. Okay. Some might argue might be the most important system. Okay? But even beyond that, the cardiovascular system has other functions as well that we're going to talk about today. Right. And just like we talked about on Tuesday, proper maintenance of your cardiovascular system is vital to your overall health. And the primary ways that we do this is through diet and exercise. Right. And the network is extremely vast. And so, again, another point from Tuesday, if you took all your blood vessels inside your body, which are so tightly bound up, and you laid them kind of end to end, it would span about 60,000 miles. For the average person. So, basically everyone has about 60,000 miles of blood vessels inside of them, which is, for me, really, really crazy to think about. Okay, so let's talk about some of the other functions of the cardiovascular system, right? And so there's 4 of them. And so the primary function, just like we just talked about, is a way of transporting molecules throughout the body, right? And so the primary things that gets transported are oxygen and carbon dioxide, right? And so oxygen gets taken into the lungs from your body, okay, and then from the lungs it gets absorbed into the bloodstream, and then from the bloodstream it gets transported through the rest of your body, right? Mostly a lot to the muscles, but a lot to also your internal organs in order for them to, in order to function, right? And a lot of the chemical processes in your body relies on oxygen in order to function, and that's kind of where it gets through. Okay, and also another thing we know is that a byproduct of a lot of the chemical processes in your body is the production of carbon dioxide, right? And so the typical use case is you take in oxygen to your lungs. That oxygen gets transported to your muscles. Maybe you're working out with your muscles, right? And then as a byproduct of the chemical processes in your muscles, carbon dioxide waste is produced, and then that also gets transported into the bloodstream, back to your lungs, and then out through your body. Okay. And so this transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide is a really important function of the cardiovascular system. But also, vitamins, nutrients, hormones, enzymes, they also travel through the cardiovascular system as well. Okay? And so remember, cardiovascular system, think of it as your means of transport in your body. It's like the supply chain of your body. Okay. Another important function of the cardiovascular system lies in defense and healing, right? And so your immune system lives in your cardiovascular system. And so anytime you have an infection or anytime you have a wound, or maybe you scraped yourself or cut yourself, right? Then your cardiovascular system is going to be the one that's going to, either fight the infection or to heal or patch up the wound. Okay. And the primary organisms that do this are your white blood cells and your platelets. And so we'll talk about that more later on in the class. Okay. Your cardiovascular system is also basically acts as the heat exchanger in your body. Okay. And so heat needs to also move through your body. Okay. Because your muscles and your internal organs produce heat, and so that needs to be either transported out of the body, or if your body needs to cool down, then the cardiovascular system also helps in exchanging heat as well, right? Because hopefully, if you've taken a heat transfer class before, or maybe you're taking heat transfer now, what you'll learn is that one of the most effective ways to transport heat is through a moving fluid, right? And so that's when convection occurs. And so the only moving fluid that's going through your body is your cardiovascular system. And so it basically acts like a heat exchanger for your body. Right. And so the fourth function, which is also an important one, is it helps keep the balance of fluids in your body as well. Right. And so it can also transport fluids or water from one part of your body to the next. And that helps with regulating regulating the bodily functions as well. Right? And so these are the four main functions of the cardiovascular system. And so you can see they're all, extremely important to your body. And so that's why, proper maintenance of the cardiovascular system is super important for your overall health. Any questions on this so far? All right, so let's talk about the components of the cardiovascular system. So what is it really consist of, right? And so the first most important component is the blood itself, right? And so this is the fluid. You can think of the fluid that flows in your body, okay? And so your blood is it flows through your heart, it flows through your blood vessels, and it goes through the capillaries and everything like that. So that's the fluid that's kind of constantly moving through your body because your heart is always pumping, right? All right, and so speaking of the heart, your heart is the main pumping mechanism, right? And so if you think of your cardiovascular system as a system of pipes inside your body, then the thing that makes it go, the thing that makes it flow, is your heart, right? And so each time your heart pumps, you could think of it as providing kinetic energy to the blood to make sure that it's constantly flowing throughout your body, right? And so your heart, is a muscle, and so every time your heart pumps, you can think of it as adding, that kind of energy, and that energy is essential in order to make sure the heart or the blood is constantly flowing through all parts of your body. All right, next we're going to talk about the different kinds of blood vessels, right? And so the first type of blood vessels are the arteries, okay? And so the arteries, you can think of them as like the distribution system, right? And so they take blood away from the heart, okay? Because when the heart pumps, it has to pump into an artery, okay? And so so the arteries are going to take blood away from the heart and carry it to all the different parts of the body that it needs to go, right? And so your arteries are going to carry blood from your heart to your muscles. It's going to carry it to all the organs and basically where it needs to go. So your arteries, you can think of it as, it takes the blood from the heart and it distributes it to all the places that it needs to go. Okay. After the blood goes through the arteries, it enters these really tiny vessels called capillaries. Okay, and capillaries are these really, really, really tiny blood vessels in your body. That are literally the diameter of these capillaries are oftentimes just one blood cell in diameter, right? So only one blood cell can fit through here at a time, right? And these act as like an exchange system, right? And so the capillaries exist in basically all the muscles in your body, or basically all the parts of your body that need oxygen, right? And it's inside the capillaries that this exchange of oxygen takes place, right? And so blood is going to come in here. And so the blood is going to be rich in oxygen. Okay, so O2 is going to come in. And then while it's inside the capillaries, then the O2 is going to come out of the blood. Okay, and it's going to be used by the muscle. Okay, so O2 comes out. And then what gets put in is CO2, right? And so we have this exchange of of molecules that occur at the capillaries, right? So O2 goes out, CO2 goes in, right? And the only reason this can occur in the capillaries is because they are so small, right? Because the thing inside your blood that actually carries the oxygen are the blood cells, right? And so in order for the blood cell to kind of give up its contents, it needs to be pushed up against the blood vessel wall, and so that's why the capillaries are so small, right? Because they they need to be able to exchange oxygen and CO2 there. Okay. All right, and so once the exchange of molecules is complete, then the blood needs to return to the heart, right? And so that's what your veins are used for, right? And so your veins basically carry blood once it's gone through the capillaries back towards the heart, okay? And then once the blood returns to the heart, then the heart is going to pump and it's going to, it's going to send the blood to the to your lungs to get the oxygen, and then it's going to pump out through the arteries again, okay? All right. And so sometimes, what you'll see, and I've used the same color coding here as well, is that you'll see arteries, highlighted with a red color, okay? And then veins are often colored with blue, okay? And what these colors usually mean is they're meant to represent the degree of oxygen saturation, right? And so whenever you see blood that's really red, that's this really bright red, usually it means it's filled with O2, okay? And so we say that blood that's bright red like this is oxygenated. Okay. Whereas blood that's blue, or that's represented by a blue color, is deoxygenated. Okay. Okay, and so that's all that the colors represent, is that they represent how much oxygen is inside the bloods. Okay, and so sometimes what you'll see is that I was very careful with how I describe arteries and veins here, right? Because sometimes what you'll see and often actually in textbooks too, incorrectly, right? What they'll say is that arteries contain oxygenated blood. Okay. While veins will contain deoxygenated blood. Okay. Hence their usual color scheme, right? But this is incorrect, right? And so, the precise definition for arteries is that they carry blood away, and veins carry blood back to the heart, right? There are actually instances in your body where you have arteries carrying deoxygenated blood, and you have veins that actually carry oxygenated blood. Okay, and so I want to caution you guys, because if you look up some information about arteries and veins, you might find information like this, and that's false. Okay. And we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about that special instance on the next slide. Okay. Okay. Any questions on this so far? Okay. All right. Oh, I should have clicked one more time. And so the main subject for this class is going to be on the blood vessels, right? And so we're going to be focusing mostly on the arteries and the veins, and actually mostly on the arteries, right? And so your final project, you're going to be doing simulation on the arteries mostly. Okay. Okay. And so, the previous image is kind of just a very general, figure. But here's how your entire cardiovascular system is organized. Okay. And so in the middle right here, we have your heart. Okay. And so this kind of box right here is your heart. I know that this is not the most aesthetically pleasing representation of the cardiovascular system, but I think it's also the cleanest one to read. Okay. All right. And so, your blood, your heart goes through your blood goes through your heart, right here. Okay. And then usually the circulation that we're normally accustomed to seeing is this one right here. Okay. And so this is what's known as your systemic circulation. Right? And so your systemic circulation refers to most of your body. Okay. Okay. And so this is like your arms, your legs, your internal organs, and everything like that. Okay. But you actually have another cardiovascular pipeline in your body that runs parallel to the systemic system, and that's called the pulmonary system. Okay. And so pulmonary is another word for your lungs. Okay, right? And so your heart actually pumps blood through both of these systems at the same time, right? And so it's going to be pumping blood through your body, but then when the blood comes back, it has to actually go through your lungs, okay? And so if you want to trace out the full path of the blood, you can kind of start anywhere that you want, but let's start in the left ventricle, okay? And so blood in the left ventricle is going to be oxygenated, okay? And so oxygenated blood is going to be pumped out through your systemic system, okay? Okay. And then as it goes through the systemic system, it's going to lose its oxygen and then come back with carbon dioxide, okay? And so at this point right here, where the blood is, it's deoxygenated, right? And so there's no oxygen. And so when the blood returns back to the right atrium, it doesn't have any oxygen in it, okay? And so in order to get oxygen, it needs to go to the lungs, right? And so when it returns to the right atrium, you can see here it's going to go this way. It's going to go through the lungs. It's going to get oxygen, okay? And then after it gets oxygen, it's going to come back to the left ventricle, and then we're back at the starting point right here, okay? So let me clear this up just so you can kind of see the path kind of in in a cleaner way. So it kind of makes like this figure 8 through this whole figure, right? So it's going to go like this, like that, okay? All right. And so let's go back to the definition of arteries and veins, right? So remember, arteries take blood away from your heart, right? And so everything on this side of the screen right here on the right, everything here is arteries, right? Okay, because all of these are cases where blood is being taken away from the heart before it reaches the capillaries, right? But just like we talked about, when blood returns to the heart through the right side, right, it doesn't have any oxygen yet, right? Because it needs to go through the lungs to get oxygen. The blood doesn't get oxygen until it reaches this point right here, right? And so these arteries right here actually are deoxygenated. Okay. And so this is a case where, we have an artery that's taking blood away from your heart that does not have any oxygen, okay? And then by the same vein, pun intended, right? And when we look at the veins here in the pulmonary system, this is after the blood has obtained oxygen from the lungs, right? And so this blood here is oxygenated, okay? And so your lungs have a system of arteries and veins as well, but the degree of oxygenation is flipped for the pulmonary for the lungs, because that's where the blood actually goes to get oxygen, right? And so if you were to kind of summarize it, it would look kind of something like this, right? In the systemic system, which goes to the majority of your body, you're going to have oxygenated blood in the arteries and deoxygenated blood in the veins, whereas in the lungs, you're going to have deoxygenated blood in the arteries and oxygenated blood in the veins. Okay. And so I'm making a big deal of this because it's one of the biggest misconceptions that I see about the cardiovascular system, and I want to make sure that I address it. Maybe at least for me, when I learned biology in high school, I always learned that arteries had oxygenated blood, and that's one thing that I want to make sure that you guys don't fall into that trap as well. All right, any questions on this so far? Okay. Okay. And so now let's start talking about anatomy. Okay. And so when you see the word anatomy, anatomy basically just refers to the names and functions of all the organs in your body. Okay. So it's almost like vocabulary, basically. And so I think the anatomy that most people are familiar with is like skeletal anatomy, right? And so when you think of skeletal anatomy, you're thinking of all the different, you think of all the different names of the different bones in your body and what their functions are, right? But when we talk about cardiovascular anatomy, we want to name all the different, organs in the cardiovascular system, as well as the names of all the major blood vessels, right? And so I will say that, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of different blood vessels in your body, and you'd be surprised that most of them actually have a name for some reason. And so, we're not going to go over the names of every single artery, because that would be, I think, a waste of everyone's time. But I did want to mention kind of the major players in the cardiac, cardiovascular system. Okay. And so we're going to start inside the heart. Okay. And so if you're unfamiliar with the terminology cardiac, okay, whenever you see cardiac or cardio or cardi something, not Cardi B, she kind of stole it from doctors, right? Cardiac anything means something around the heart, okay? Okay. And so when we talk about the cardiovascular system, we're talking about the heart and blood vessels of the body, okay? So the cardio and cardiovascular refers to the heart, right? Okay, and so let's talk about the different chambers of the heart, right? And so the first types of chambers that I want to talk about are the ventricles, okay? And so your ventricles, you have two of them. You have a right ventricle and you have a left ventricle, okay? And so your ventricles are your very muscular chambers, and so they're basically the ones that are responsible for doing all the hard work of pumping the blood, right? And so if you kind of look at a real a real person, their ventricles are going to be very, very muscular, right? And so you actually kind of see that in this picture as well. And so you can see that around the ventricles right here, you can see that this tissue around it is a little bit thicker, right? And so that thickness basically represents how the ventricles are very, they have a lot of muscles, okay? And that's important because they actually have to pump blood, through your body. Okay? And so you have two of them, right? So you have your left ventricle, and so your left ventricle is typically, usually more muscular than your right ventricle, right? And so that you can see that in this figure right here, okay? And so your left ventricle is responsible for pumping blood through your systemic system, right? And so this is the chamber that pumps blood through most of your body, okay? Whereas the right ventricle is responsible for pumping blood to the lungs, okay? And so your lungs are a much smaller system, and so compared to the rest of your body, and so the right ventricle is typically less muscular, okay? All right. And so next we're going to talk about the atria. Okay, so you have two atriums, and so you have a right atrium and a left atrium, right? And so the atria are primarily collection chambers, right? And so when the blood returns to the heart, either from the systemic veins or from the pulmonary veins, they have to be collected into a chamber just for kind of temporary storage. And so the atria serve as this collection chamber. Okay. They have a little bit of musculature to them because they still can pump, and so they do have some active components, but they're very, very passive compared to the ventricle, and so they basically just kind of passively fill, and then when the ventricles are ready to pump another load, then the atriums kind of put blood into the ventricles. Okay, and so you can almost think of the atria as almost like a loading chamber, right? And so they're like a waiting room, and so blood arrives back in the heart. And so once the blood arrives, the ventricle's probably not ready for them yet. And so they kind of just wait inside the atrium. And then when the ventricles are ready, then the atrium unleashes the blood into the ventricles. And then, it goes through the rest of the body. Okay. Okay. And so, just like we mentioned that there's two of them. So your left atrium is like the waiting room for the left ventricle. And the right atrium is the waiting room for the right ventricle. Okay. All right. And your heart also has a complex system of valves as well, right? And so your valves are basically structures inside your heart that ensure blood only flows in one direction, right? So this is really important because, your valves are there to basically make sure the blood is always going in the right direction because, these chambers or the ventricles, when they pump, they kind of just squeeze, right? And so you can imagine if you squeeze a bag, and you fill like a plastic bag filled with water and you squeeze it really suddenly, the water's just going to go everywhere, all over your counter, and then and your girlfriend's going to get mad at you and she's going to make you clean it up, right? And so the valves are really important just to make sure that the blood always goes in the direction that it needs to go. Okay, this is particularly important because of the atria, right? So when the ventricle pump, and so when your left ventricle and right ventricle pumps, you want to make sure that blood doesn't flow back into the atrium, right? And so we don't want this. And so we want the blood to actually go out the blood vessels like it's supposed to, right? And so the valves are there to make sure that that happens. Okay. And so you have 4 valves in your heart, which I believe on the next slide that we're going to talk about, where they are and what their names are. Okay. But this is the basic anatomy of your heart, right? So you have your 2 ventricles, your 2 atria, and then you have your valves that are there to control the flow. Okay. Any questions on this so far? Okay. All right. Oh, I guess we don't have valves yet. I think valves are next. Okay. Oh, question?
Yeah, what happened to the blood flow backward?
Yeah, if the blood flows backwards, that's you start to have a lot of inefficiencies in your heart, because your whole cardiovascular system is kind of predicated on the fact that the blood that's going out your left ventricle is going to be full of oxygen, and the blood that's going to your lungs is not full of oxygen, and so they're full of carbon dioxide. If you start to have leaky valves, and so if you start to have some backflow in your heart, that really damages the efficiency of your system, right? And so you can imagine, when your left ventricle pumps, it's just, the way your body is designed so that all the blood should go out this way, right? So you have a certain volume of blood that gets ejected into your body. But if you have a leaky valve right here, and some of that blood actually comes back to the left atrium, then your body is not getting as much blood as it needs to. And your body senses that. And so if you're not getting enough blood from your heart, then your muscles are going to send signals, chemical signals to your heart. You say, hey, I need more oxygen. I need you to pump harder. And so to kind of compensate for this leaky valve right here, then your heart actually starts to pump harder and starts to pump faster. Which on a short-term basis is not usually a bad thing, because people exercise all the time and your heart rate gets elevated from that. But if that's happening constantly, and so if your heart is kind of in this constant state of having to work harder than it should, then it's going to fatigue out, and your heart's just not going to work later on in your life as well as it should. And so your valves kind of make sure that that your heart is working as efficiently as possible to prevent any kind of this backflow. Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right, question. Would temperatures be constantly? Oh, would temperatures be constant? Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, the temperatures they fluctuate, and so actually inside your heart, the temperatures. Your heart is relatively well insulated because it's kind of deep inside your body. The place where heat gets kind of exchanged a lot with your blood vessels is actually near your extremities, and so when your blood actually comes close to your skin, that's when it kind of exchanges heat, with the outside world. But usually by the time your blood reaches your heart, then it's usually fairly insulated, because your heart is not that close to the outside of your body. And so, the temperature inside the heart is fairly constant, but as the blood flows through the rest of your body, then the temperatures will change, depending on how hot or cold it is on the outside. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the heart cycle. Okay. And so, every time your heart beats, that's considered as one heart cycle, right? And so I think one thing that that's always fun to do is to kind of feel your heartbeat, right? And so if you kind of take your 2 fingers, I've always learned it as 2 fingers, and you kind of tilt your head up and you try to find your jugular. Okay, you can kind of feel your heart beating, right? And so each time your heart beats, or each time your heart pumps, that consists of one heart cycle. Okay, and so there's 2 phases to the heart cycle, right? And so there's systole. Okay, and so systole refers to when your heart chamber is contracting, okay, or in other words, your ventricles. And so when your heart is in that action of like squeezing together, we call that systole. Okay, but after it squeezes, the heart chamber has to relax and to let blood back into it, and so we call that diastole. Okay, so we have systole, diastole, systole, diastole. Okay. Question. So do I know why temperature inside the body is usually 37 degrees C? Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think I have a great answer for you beyond the fact that I think a lot of the chemical and biological processes in your body usually like to occur at that temperature. And so just to make sure that oxygen transport happens okay, just like the transformation of energy inside your body, everything having to do with like waste production or waste removal. A lot of those processes like to happen at that temperature, and so your body kind of does its best to kind of regulate the temperature to kind of maintain that constant. Yeah. Yeah. The hypothalamus, that's part of the brain, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right? I think if you're mentioning that, that might be the part of the brain that kind of regulates that stuff. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. All right. And so if you've ever seen a plot of your blood pressure, your blood pressure kind of goes up and down, with each heartbeat, right? And so as you can imagine, when the heart is fully contracted, that's when your blood pressure is at a maximum. Okay. Whereas your blood pressure goes to a minimum when your heart is relaxing. Okay. And so it kind of jumps between these two extremes of like systole, diastole. Okay. And probably, if you've taken your blood pressure recently, you know that your blood pressure is always reported as two different numbers, right? And so a normal healthy blood pressure is what they call 120/80, okay? And so what these two numbers represent, the first number is your systolic blood pressure. And so this is the maximum blood pressure in your, within a heart cycle. And the second number is your diastolic heart pressure. And so that's the lowest blood pressure that it achieves when the heart is fully relaxed, okay? And so, the reason your blood pressure is reported at these two numbers is that, they both kind of serve an important clinical need, okay? And so if you have high blood pressure, usually when you have high blood pressure, then both of these numbers are elevated, okay? But there are conditions where, maybe only your systolic blood pressure is elevated, but your diastolic is normal. But then there's also conditions where, maybe your diastolic pressure is elevated, but your systolic is normal as well, okay? And so that's why it's always reported as two different numbers. And if you were ever curious about, what the units for blood pressure are, the units are known as millimeters of mercury, okay? And so if you remember from fluid mechanics, there's a device known as a manometer, right? So let's say that you have flown a pipe like this, okay? And then, if you have a manometer like this, okay? This is kind of one of the first things that you learn in fluid statics is that, depending on the height of this manometer right here, or the height that the fluid column reaches, that will tell you what the pressure inside the fluid is, right? And so back in the old days, kind of back, when the medical profession was kind of starting out, the way that doctors measured pressure inside a person's body was with manometers, actually. And so but the fluid that they use inside the manometer was liquid mercury, okay? And the reason liquid mercury was used is that mercury is incredibly dense, and so it has one of the highest densities of fluids kind of out there, right? And so because it's so dense, then the fluid column of mercury doesn't have to reach so high in order for it to to measure pressure. And so it made for a great fluid for those devices where you want to try to keep them compact. Okay. And then even though nowadays we have more sophisticated ways of measuring pressure, I mean, almost nobody uses a mercury manometer anymore. This convention kind of stuck because we have these kind of nice 3-digit numbers which are kind of easy to remember. And so that's kind of the origin of why we use millimeters of mercury for measuring blood pressure. Okay. Versus more engineering, what I call engineering measures of pressure, like Pascal, kilopascal, or bar, or something like that. Okay. Any questions on this? Okay. Okay. And so maybe I swapped the slide, but we're back inside the heart, okay? And so now we're going to talk about the valves, okay? And so just like I mentioned before, we have 4 different valves in the body, okay? 4 different valves in the heart, excuse me, okay? And so the first valve is the tricuspid valve, and so the tricuspid valve is located right here, okay? And so the tricuspid valve is between the right atrium and the right ventricle, and its main function is to prevent backflow back into the right atrium, okay? Next, we have the pulmonary valve, and so the pulmonary valve exists at the exit of the right ventricle, okay? And so what this does, it prevents backflow back into the right ventricle, right? And so this makes sure that once the right ventricle expels blood into the lungs, then it makes sure that none of that blood comes back, okay? Next, we have the mitral valve, and so the mitral valve stands between the left atrium and the left ventricle. And again, this is to prevent backflow back into the left atrium. Okay, and the last valve we have here is the aortic valve, which exists at the exit of the left ventricle, and this is to prevent backflow back into the left ventricle. Okay, and so all the valves kind of serve the same purpose. It's just to prevent any kind of backflow from happening. Okay. All right, and so we also have some major arteries here, okay? And so, I'm not gonna make you memorize all the major arteries in the body because there's a lot of them, but you should know the ones around the heart because those are pretty important. And a lot of you are actually probably gonna do your project around this section too, okay? All right, so let's start on the venous side. And so first we have the vena cava, okay? And so there's actually two parts of the vena cava. So there's the superior one, which is on top, and then the inferior one, which is on the bottom. Okay, and so these are the main veins in your body, and so they collect blood from the rest of your body, and then return it to the heart into the right atrium. Okay, so the superior vena cava returns blood kind of from your upper body. Your inferior vena cava returns blood from your lower body. Okay. Next, we have the pulmonary artery. Okay, and so the pulmonary artery takes blood from the heart and carries it to the lungs. Okay, and then we have the pulmonary vein, which takes blood from the lungs and brings it back to your heart through the left atrium. Okay, and then finally we have probably the biggest blood vessel in your body, and I think the subject probably a lot of you will choose this for your projects, is the aorta. Okay, and so the aorta is the biggest artery in your body, and it's the kind of the first pipe or the first blood vessel that takes oxygenated blood and then starts to distribute it through the rest of your body. Okay, and so from the aorta you have a bunch of different blood vessels that branch off of it that take blood to your head, to your arms, to your legs, to your kidneys, to your to your digestive system, and all that stuff. Okay, and so those are the major names of the valves and the vessels, and just a brief description of what their functions. Okay. Any questions on this so far? Right. Okay, so let's talk about valves a bit more. And so I think this goes back to Jack's question a little bit earlier. And so, let's look at what a typical healthy valve looks like, right? And so if your valve is healthy, it should look something like this. And so when it opens, it should have a very nice large orifice for blood to pass through, okay? And when it closes, it should make a very tight seal, okay? Right, and so this tight seal prevents any blood from leaking through the valve, okay? And these structures right here, right? So you can think of these structures as almost like a we call them a leaflet, right? And so these leaflets are supposed to kind of open up like this, right? And so they almost like you can almost think of like a flower that's blooming, right? So they open up like this, and when they close, they kind of shut like that, right? And so these leaflets ideally should be flexible because they're supposed to open and close quite a bit, and they should seal very, very well, right? And so the signs of a healthy valve are in leaflets that are still very flexible, but still are fairly strong to prevent any backflow. Okay. When you start to get valve disease, or when your valves start to break down, they tend to look something like this, right? And so usually the way that valves get disease is that the leaflets, they start to lose some of their properties, and so the leaflets start to get a little bit stiff. You can see here we have this kind of crusty stuff that's kind of building up on the leaflets. Okay. And so when the leaflets start to get stiff, you can almost think of it as like a rusty machine, right? And so a rusty machine, it's a little bit, it's always really hard for it to kind of, move. And so a diseased valve kind of acts the same way. And so when you have a stiff leaflet, instead of kind of opening up very smoothly, it kind of like creaks open like this, right? And so when it kind of reaches its fully open state, this orifice here is not as big as it's supposed to go. Okay, and so blood kind of has a hard time going through a diseased valve, because it's not opening as much as it could. Okay, by that same token, because the valves are a lot stiffer and it's a lot harder for them to move, they don't form a good seal when they're closed too, right? And so even when they're closed, you can see here that we still have kind of a hole that's there, right? And that's a problem because when you have a hole like this and the valves aren't sealing, then blood is going to leak through there, when it's not supposed to. Okay. And so when people, when doctors say that, you have a valve disease or you need a valve replacement, usually it's because your valves are having a hard time opening and closing, as efficiently as a normal valve. Okay. Which I think, when I first learned this, it was really fascinating because, this is almost like a purely mechanical, dysfunction here, right? And so if you're designing like a pipe flow system and you say that you have a faulty valve, right? And so like, let's say that you're designing the pipe flow for like, a kitchen sink or like a bathroom sink, and you say that you have a faulty valve. This is kind of what you imagine, right? And so the valve is probably having a hard time closing. It's probably having a hard time opening just because it's dysfunctional, right? And so when you hear the word disease, I think people kind of think of like, maybe something like COVID, where it's like a bacterial infection, like it's something biological. It's not something mechanical. But when you talk about valve disease, you can see it actually has a very mechanical kind of physical kind of origin, right? It's literally because the valve physically can't open and close, okay? Because it's too stiff, right? And actually, a lot of cardiovascular diseases are like this too, right? And so, a lot of the really fancy cardiovascular diseases that you'll see throughout the class, they're meant to act. They're actually describing something physical that's happening with the fluid mechanics. And when doctors go in to fix it, they actually are essentially performing some plumbing. Inside the human body. So, I always found that to be very, 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 very fascinating.
Dr. Trent.
Yep. What's up?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Kev.
No, go ahead. You're good.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Do the valves open and close are these valves like a part of the muscles, or they just open and close by pressure of the blood that's pumping out in it?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So so these valves are actually just all totally passive, and so there's no active component. So there's these valves aren't laced with muscles, and so the body can't control whether they open or close. They open and close just purely based on pressure. Yeah, and so when the pressure for this valve right here, like when the pressure inside the heart is greater than on the other side, then the valve is going to open. Okay, but when the pressure gradient reverses, and so when you have low pressure here, the valves just kind of close on by themselves, and so they're completely passive. Yeah. And then Kevin, you had a question too?
Yeah, I think you kind of answered it though. It was just if blood flow was governed by pressure differences.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, they are. And so your heart is actually the one that's creating these pressure differences by pumping. So every time it pumps, it creates a high amount of pressure inside your body, which pushes the blood through.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Mm-hmm. And actually, Jack, going back to your question too. So when people get a heart valve replacement, the thing that the doctors actually stick inside the person is actually just a regular mechanical valve. Okay, it's not like a regular valve, like not like one you would stick inside a pipe, but it actually acts like the same way. And so there's no nerves or anything that needs to go in there. It just needs to be able to passively open and close and respond to pressure differences. And actually, a lot of the early valves, and actually still quite a bit nowadays too, not as much as it was before. But a lot of the early kind of valve replacements that people would put inside hearts were actually made of metal, because that was just, that's just how we understood how to create valves. Just we manufactured them out of metal, and we created a metal that the body would accept, and we put that metal valve inside the person. And there's still some that are like that today as well. Yeah. If you ever get a chance to visit Edwards Life Science down in Irvine, I know some of you probably are working on senior design projects with them. They actually did the Irvine office down here actually did a lot of work on heart valves, and so it's really cool. You walk through their office, they have almost like a heart valve museum, and so they have a lot of the previous heart valves that they've designed, and they have them kind of all on display, and it's super cool to kind of look at and see how we've designed valves and how their designs have changed over time. Okay, and so now let's talk about the anatomy of blood vessels, right? And so your blood vessels are basically the your arteries and your veins, right? And so they're basically the tubes inside your body, but they actually have quite a bit of a complex structure, right? And so there's 3 different layers to your blood vessel, and so we have the adventitia, we have the media, and we have the intima. Okay, and so we'll go from the outside in, and so on the outside we have your adventitia, okay, and this is primarily made of a material called collagen, okay. The thick layer in the middle here is called the media. Okay, and so this is the middle layer, and this contains smooth muscle as well as elastin. Okay, and then your intima, this is the innermost layer, and so this is where your blood vessel actually makes contact with the blood itself, and so you can think of the blood kind of flowing this way, just like that. Okay, this is called the intima, and so it consists of just a single layer of cells, which you can kind of see right here. Okay. And so your blood vessels, they have elastic material properties, and so you can almost think of them as any kind of elastic material, and their strength really depends on the ratio of the amount of elastin and collagen. Okay, and so the collagen is mostly there to add strength to the blood vessels, whereas the elastin adds some flexibility. Okay. And one thing we'll talk about a lot in this class is the thickness of your vessel wall, right? And so if you think of a pipe, the pipe itself, the solid part of the pipe usually has a certain thickness, and your blood vessels are the same way. And so the thickness of the vessel walls, is actually an important part of the cardiovascular system. And in fact, the thickness is going to adapt based on how strong the hydrodynamic forces and pressures are, within that vessel. Okay. Okay. So now let's talk about the blood itself, right? And so blood is extremely fascinating because we usually think of blood as a fluid, right? And so if you cut yourself and blood starts to come out, it looks like thin ketchup, that's what some people have said. But it's actually much more than just a fluid, right? So it's not really just like water right here. And so blood is unique because it's actually what's called a suspension of particles. Okay. And so inside your blood are actually millions and billions of different cells and molecules that are suspended within this what's called a plasma, which is not really a fluid. Okay. And so believe it or not, we still don't fully understand how blood actually works in terms of its physical properties, and so that's still actually a very active area of research today. Because it's difficult to measure because a big part of your blood's behavior is due to a lot of these living cells and living organisms inside your blood, and a lot of times when you take the blood out of the body, it's hard to I won't say it's not hard to keep them alive, but it's hard to get them to do exactly the same thing as they were in the body, and so it's normally very, very difficult to study. Okay. All right, and so there's actually three constituents in the blood that we'll talk about in detail, for this class, and they're the red blood cell, the white blood cell, and the platelets. Okay. All right, so let's talk about the red blood cell first, or RBC. Okay. And so another name for the red blood cell is called the erythrocytes. Okay, so you might hear that word thrown around, and so all it means is just a red blood cell. Okay. These make up the vast majority of the blood cells inside a human. Okay, and in fact, the amount of red blood cells that you have in your body is such an important quantity that it's actually a quantity that doctors usually measure for people, and so that quantity is called hematocrit. Okay. And so typical values of hematocrit are 41 to 52% in males and 36 to 48% in females. Okay. And so what the hematocrit represents is the percentage by volume of red blood cells, inside a person's blood. Okay. And so what this means is that if you take a sample of blood, so let's say you take a milliliter of blood from a person's body, 41 to 52% of that blood is going to be consisted of red blood cells. Okay. All right. So your red blood cells, their primary function is oxygen transport. Okay. And so they can absorb an oxygen molecule or oxygen molecules and then take that to the rest of your body. Okay. And so the reason they kind of have this kind of oblong shape is to make sure that they can transport oxygen efficiently, right? And so this kind of dimple that you see in the red blood cell kind of helps it absorb oxygen, because I think the way that it's shaped is that an oxygen molecule can kind of sit right into this dimple, and then it kind of gets absorbed into the blood cell. Okay. And you can see the typical sizes here, right? And so in diameter, a red blood cell is about 7.5 micrometers. And in thickness, it's about 2 micrometers on average. So these are really, really tiny. Okay. And if you're an athlete or if you're physically active, generally speaking, athletes have a higher hematocrit than normal people because their muscles and demand a lot more oxygen than than just Professor Justin who just sits on his butt all day. Okay. And so if there's higher oxygen demand from your body, then the amount of red blood cells in your body have to increase, to compensate. Okay.
Oh, I have a question.
Yeah. What's up?
So going back to that, you said so women tend to have, I guess, less hematocrit. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it very well
Yep.
yet. So if they have a less percentage of that, what makes up the difference then? Like, I guess, that's the majority, like what other things make it up that would cause that difference?
Yeah. So the primary, the thing that's actually fluid inside a person's body is this material called plasma. And so it's kind of like this fluidy kind of substance that the blood cells can kind of be suspended in. And so for women they have just more plasma because there's less cells floating around in their body.
Oh, okay. And then so with a more athletic person, they just tend to have less plasma as well then to make up for the fact. Okay.
Exactly. Right. Yep. Okay. All right, question. So is oxygen and CO2 in gas form and flowing through the blood? So they're actually in molecular form. And so, when I say oxygen is being transported through the body, the actual oxygen molecule gets absorbed into the red blood cell. And so you can say it's actually in kind of like molecular form. So your body definitely takes it in the gaseous form. But then when the oxygen gas is inside your lungs, it actually, gets squeezed through the capillaries, inside your lungs and gets transported with your blood through that way. Yeah. But it doesn't get transformed into the liquid form, I guess, if that's what you're saying. And so as soon as the CO2 kind of comes back into your lungs through the blood vessels, then it gets released in the gaseous form as well. So you can kind of say that it's kind of always in that gaseous form, but as it transports through your body, it exists kind of just as a molecule, just riding alongside the blood cells. Yeah. Yep. Okay, so now let's talk about the white blood cells, or WBCs. Okay, so your white blood cells, the other name for that are the leukocytes. Okay, and so they actually contain they occupy a very small volume of your blood, so usually about 0.7% of the blood volume. Okay, and the white blood cells' primary responsibility is immune response. And so if your body detects something foreign, like a foreign bacteria, foreign virus, then your white blood cells are going to attack it just to protect your body. Okay. And so there's lots of different types of white blood cells that are specialized to attack different kinds of pathogens, right? And so here I have a few of them here. And so we have a monocyte, we have a I used to be able to pronounce this, but I forgot. I'm drawing a blank right now. We have basophil, we have lymphocytes, and neutrophils. Right. And so there's, basically each of these different types of white blood cells are specialized to attack a different kind of pathogen. Okay. Right. And so if your body detects an infection, and so if you're infected with a with a cold or with a virus, something like that, then your body is going to produce more white blood cells in order to fight that infection. Okay, but you always have some degree of white blood cells floating around in your body just to fight the stray bacteria that comes in or something like that. But when an infection starts to get a little bit serious, then your body produces more of these in order to fight that infection. Okay. You might have heard of the disease called leukemia. So leukemia is a very kind of scary disease where your body produces an abnormally high amount of white blood cells, and it becomes so abnormally high that the white blood cells can actually start attacking your body, which is what you don't want, right? And so you don't want your body to attack itself, right? And so that's why leukemia is such kind of a scary disease, because your body is kind of be literally destroying itself from the inside out. Okay. All right, so now let's talk about platelets. Okay, and so your platelets are actually not cells, and so they're when you think of a cell, you kind of think of like a living kind of organism. Your platelets are kind of more passive, and so they don't really have kind of a mind of its own. But the platelets' primary responsibility is in blood clotting and tissue repair. Okay. And so whenever let's say that you have an external wound. So let's say that you cut yourself, right? We know that when you cut yourself, your blood kind of flows out the wound and outside, right? And so the reason it does that is so that platelets can kind of aggregate into that wound. And once the platelets kind of aggregate there, then they kind of, and they caught the blood, and they repair the wound. Okay. All right. And so, your body kind of always has a bunch of platelets floating around in the blood, but most of the time they're just what's called unactivated, which means that they just kind of float along and not really do anything. They're just kind of chilling. Okay. It's only when they detect like either a wound has occurred or they need to clot, then they become activated. Okay. And so when they activated, platelets actually what they do is they kind of seek out other platelets, right? And so they kind of have this kind of spiky kind of appearance right here. Okay. And these kind of tendrils on the platelets actually go and seek out other platelets like that. Okay. And then they start to kind of bond together, right? And so when platelets start to bond, okay, right? And so this kind of happens at it starts with just a couple platelets, but then it kind of occurs with a lot of other platelets. And once a bunch of platelets kind of bond together, then that's when a blood clot forms, right? And so a blood clot is nothing more than when your blood kind of becomes really, really hard. Okay. And so that's how your wounds can heal, right? And so when you have a wound on your body, then a bunch of platelets are going to flood there, they're going to bond, and then once they bond, they close off the wound to prevent any further bleeding. Okay. Right. And your blood will clot for other reasons as well, but that's the primary kind of application for blood clotting is when they reach a wound like that. Okay. Right. And so you might have heard of a specific kind of medicine. It's not really medicine, but it's a particular treatment that people go through called blood thinners. Okay. And so when you say that someone is on blood thinners, a blood thinner is a special kind of chemical that impedes this activation process. Okay. And so they basically, prevent platelets from activating. Okay. And so this is really useful in some cases because, some people have, inadvertent clotting inside their blood. Okay. And so you don't want to do that. So you don't want your blood to clot in crucial areas. Okay. This is especially true for people that have a medical device inside their body, right? And so what you'll see later when we talk about medical device design is that one of the primary fears is that the blood is actually going to clot inside the machine, right? And so let's say that you have an artificial heart, right? And so you have another device inside your body that's pumping blood. If there's a clot that happens inside that device and the blood kind of curdles and it just kind of solidifies, then that device can't perform and the person just kind of dies, immediately. And so, for those kinds of patients where they don't want clotting to occur inside a device, then they might be given blood thinners just to make sure that the clotting doesn't occur. Okay. But on the flip side, you have to be really careful with when you're on blood thinners, because if you're on blood thinners, then your body can't clot blood at all. And so if you kind of have a wound or you cut yourself and you're on blood thinners, you will literally just continue to bleed out, because your blood can't clot, and so your blood just kind of empties out that wound, and then you die that way as well, right? And so kind of a morbid joke that I always heard from doctors on blood thinners, when they're giving advice to patients on blood thinners, is they say, don't go scraping your knee because you will literally bleed yourself to death if you scrape your knee when you're on blood thinners. And so it's kind of a really scary thought. Yeah. All right. Any questions on white blood cells and platelets? Okay. Oh. Okay, yeah, I forgot there's one more slide here. So another way that platelets can get activated is through actually through fluid mechanics. And so when you have high levels of viscous shear stress, that can inadvertently kind of activate a platelet as well. Okay. And so, those are the kinds of things that lead to heart attacks and strokes. Right? And so this is a primary concern for medical device designers, is to kind of prevent platelet activation. Okay. And so now that we've talked about, all the different constituents inside the blood, it's kind of fair to ask, is blood actually a fluid, right? And so, blood is actually looks something more like this, where it's a suspension of all these different, blood cells, inside this plasma, right? And so it's not really a pure fluid like we've seen before, maybe like in water or oil or things like that, okay? And so, knowing that blood is comprised of all these different blood cells, is it fair to actually say that blood is actually a fluid, right? And so think of sand, right? So when you think of sand, sand is a is a collection of all these little particulates, all these little dirt particulates together. When they're all together, sand kind of acts like a fluid, right? So you can pour sand out into a bucket, but is it fair to say that sand is a fluid? Right? And so, for all intents and purposes, yes, blood can be considered a fluid, but it's considered a very special kind of fluid called a non-Newtonian fluid. Okay. And what that means basically is that the relationship between shear stress and the velocity gradient is not linear. Okay. And so for most fluids, we have this relationship where the shear stress inside the fluid is equal to the viscosity times the derivative of velocity. Okay. And that's true for most fluids. But there are also non-Newtonian fluids where this relationship does not hold, right? And so I think probably the more popular one that people have seen is oobleck, right? And so if you've ever seen a mixture of cornstarch and water, and you've seen people like punch it and like break their hands because it becomes really hard, oobleck is another example of a non-Newtonian fluid, right? And so blood is also non-Newtonian, but it's kind of non-Newtonian in the other direction, right? And so in oobleck, the faster that you shear it, it actually kind of becomes harder, right? And so they call that a shear thickening fluid. Blood is the opposite. And so the more you shear blood, actually the thinner that it gets. And so, that's why it's called a shear thinning fluid, right? And so for that reason, blood, and so because blood is a non-Newtonian fluid, it actually doesn't obey the Navier-Stokes equations or any other equations of fluid motion, not exactly anyway. Okay? But the lucky thing for us, and especially for CFD engineers everywhere, is that this non-Newtonian behavior, the fact that blood is shear thinning, is only really observed in the tiniest of vessels, and so they're only observed in the capillaries. And so when we're doing simulations on like the aorta or some of the bigger vessels, making the assumption that blood is Newtonian is pretty reasonable. And there's lots of there's actually a lot of experiments and a lot of data out there that suggest that this is a reasonable assumption. Okay. And so that's nice because now we can use CFD to basically simulate blood in the greater arteries, and and we're going to get pretty close to actual behavior. Okay. And so bottom line, blood is non-Newtonian, but you only really observe that non-Newtonian fluid on the smallest of length scales, and so for most cases you're gonna be okay. 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 All right, and so just to give you a sense of how of the dimensions of the cardiovascular system, I have some measurements here, for you, okay? Because I think it's easy to kind of think the cardiovascular system is bigger than it is, because you see images like this where this pipe looks huge right here, or you look at, where's another one? You look at something like this and these pipes look huge, but the diameter of these vessels is actually extremely small, and so the aorta, which is actually the biggest vessel in your body, it only has a diameter of about 2 centimeters. Okay. And you think of 2 centimeters, that's about about an inch wide, right? And so these blood vessels are all extremely small. You can see their dimensions here. Okay. And so the aorta, you can see the diameter of the aorta is only about 22 millimeters, which is 2.2 centimeters. Okay. And even the large arteries, what's considered large, those only have a diameter of about 6 millimeters. Okay. And so you're talking very, very small dimensions here. Okay. And then here's, measurements for the length, the amount of them, the volume, cross-sectional areas, and mean pressures. Okay. And so this table is kind of nice because I think it gives a good sense of, the scale of what we're dealing with inside the cardiovascular system. All right, and so let's talk pressure, okay? And so I think this is kind of alluding back to Kevin's question earlier, right? And so since blood flow is purely internal, right, and so it's an internal system, it's a closed system, pressure is the main driving force for the blood, okay? And this pressure force is supplied whenever the heart pumps, right? And so the heart pumps is going to cause a spike in pressure, and then that's going to drive the flow forward, okay? But actually, your blood pressure kind of varies depending on what location you're in inside the body. Okay. Right. And so generally, I'm speaking, you're, if you just kind of take a snapshot in time, and so you just kind of freeze the blood just in time, right? The highest blood pressure that you'll see is kind of right near the heart, right? And so that's where blood pressure is the highest. Then because of, of viscous losses, the blood pressure tends to decrease as you flow through the cardiovascular tree. Okay, all the way until when it returns back to the heart. Right. And so if you kind of remember from fluid mechanics, if you remember the unit on pipe flow, we talked about this as well, right? And so anytime you have fluid that's flowing through a pipe, you have what are called head losses, right? And so those head losses are due to the fact that you have friction inside the flow, right? And so in order to compensate for the loss of energy to the friction, then the pressure must decrease in order to keep driving the flow forward, right? And so the cardiovascular system is the same way. And so depending on where you're measuring the blood pressure, you're going to get a different number, right? And so if you measure the blood pressure near your heart versus if you measure the blood pressure, in your fingers, it's going to be slightly different. Okay. Right. Right.
Professor,
oh, go ahead.
Is the dotted lines just the average between your height, the two pressures?
Yeah. So the dotted lines, I think, is the variance in between people. Yeah. Yeah. So there's a lot of variance in these measurements, depending on how big a person is, usually, and so this is just showing the variance in between them. Yeah. All right. And so the absolute pressure of the absolute value of the blood pressure depends actually on the size and flexibility of the capillary bed. Okay, and so if you remember from earlier, right? What we said was usually people's blood pressure is measured as 120/80. Okay, and usually that blood pressure is measured, somewhere in the large arteries, right? And so, if you think about, when you go to the doctors and they measure your blood pressure, they usually take it in your arm, right? And so, the fact that the pressure never goes down to zero there means that there's always some kind of base pressure. Okay? And that base pressure is determined by actually the capillaries. Okay, and we'll talk about this actually quite a bit in the class because it's a pretty important concept. Okay, and so generally speaking, if your capillaries are small and stiff, it's going to require a lot more force to push the blood through those capillaries, right? And so what you'll see actually a lot is that because usually as people age, they tend to lose a lot of the elastin inside their bodies, right? And so that's kind of why old people kind of get wrinkly, and so that effect also takes place in your cardiovascular system as well, right? And so generally speaking, as people age, their blood pressure actually tends to go up, right? And the reason for that is because their capillaries kind of get a little bit stiffer than before, right? And so if the capillaries are stiffer, that requires more force to push the blood through, and that force has to come from the pressure. And so the pressure has to rise, as a result of that. Okay. All right. And so if you have high blood pressure, and which another name for high blood pressure is hypertension, what that basically indicates is that your heart has to work, pretty hard to pump the blood because, an elevated pressure here means that, the thing that's creating that elevated pressure is your heart itself, right? And so high blood pressure means that your heart is kind of working a little bit too hard, to produce the blood. And so, that's why people say that high blood pressure is typically a bad thing because your heart is kind of working harder than it has to be. And if your heart is working too hard, then it's going to fatigue out faster, and you're going to put yourself at risk for heart failure or some other cardiac diseases. Okay.
Professor, what about low blood pressure?
Yeah, low blood pressure. Generally speaking, low blood pressure is a good thing if the person is physically fit. And so I think I remember reading before that like Michael Phelps had like an absurdly low blood pressure and like an absurdly low heart rate, and that's a function of his that his heart is just super efficient. But there are pathologically low blood pressures as well. And so if you have a pathologically low blood pressure, that means your heart is kind of in this stage of like heart fatigue and heart failure. And so that if you have like abnormally low heart blood pressure, then your heart just doesn't have the strength, it doesn't have the muscles anymore to pump, and so the blood pressure in your body is really low. And so that could indicate your heart is failing, or that your blood is not circulating as much as it could be. And so the blood in your body is going really slowly, which has a lot of negative effects in your body as well. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's it, I think. Oh, I thought I had more slides after this. All right, so that's it. And so That's that's kind of a crash course in cardiovascular anatomy. Okay, and so I know it was kind of a lot of information today, but I think all this information was kind of necessary to kind of begin with, so that we can actually start talking about these in relation to fluid mechanics. Okay, and so next week when we come back, I'm going to do a review of fluid mechanics, and so but I wanted to do this one first, so that as we talk about the fluid mechanics, we can talk about how that relates to the anatomy and the physiology. Okay. All right, any final questions on this before we wrap it up for the week? Okay, all right, so that's all I had planned for today. So thank you everyone for tuning in today. I know it was a lot of information, but we'll keep coming back to this throughout the semester, and so don't feel pressured to kind of absorb everything right away. And so we'll definitely kind of refer back to this. Right? So hope you guys enjoy the rest of your evening. Hope you guys enjoy your first weekend, and I'll see you next Tuesday.
Thank you.
Thanks, Professor. Have a good weekend.
Thanks, Dr. Trent.
Thanks, guys.
Dr. Tran.
Yep.
Hey, Dr. Trent, I actually thought of a question for you.
Sure. What's up?
You mentioned like the high blood pressure indicates that the heart has to pump harder. How does that affect like the valves and like the amount of blood that's being pumped through them? Because you said it depends on pressure.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And so, there's a couple things. And so, for the valves, the thing that opens and closes them is actually, not really the absolute pressure, but kind of the difference in pressure. And so if you have kind of a high pressure here and a lower pressure here, then that's going to cause the valve to open and cause blood to flow that way. But if it's reversed, then that's going to cause the valves to close. But the absolute value of the pressure doesn't really matter. It's really just the differences in pressure.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. So when people say they have high blood pressure, that means that their overall value, like the average value of their blood pressure, is high.
Okay.
But with that said, if you do have high blood pressure, that could be an indicator that your valves are diseased, and so that could be one reason. And so if you have kind of a crusty valve like this, just like we talked about earlier, in order for your blood to, in order for your body to get the proper circulation, and if you have kind of faulty valves like this, then the heart has to work just that much harder to do that. And if the heart is working harder, then it's going to produce higher pressures as well. And so, a faulty valve like this could also preclude high blood pressure as well.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Quick question. So I'm not too familiar with the whole anatomy of like the body and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to gauge how extensive we're gonna actually use the terminology and the functions, so that way I can like kind of better prepare myself.
Yeah. So this is all I'm expecting you to know. Like everything in this figure right here, this is all that I'm expecting you to know right here. And so just kind of the names of these chambers and these vessels. And so a lot of this class, actually, we're going to be talking about kind of the more microphysics. And so kind of in a generic blood vessel, what's going to happen in here. And so the exact name of the blood vessel isn't as important, but you should know kind of the major ones, which are in this figure right here. And so I might refer to these, I'm going to use the word aorta a lot, just because it's the biggest blood vessel and it's the easiest one to find. But beyond this figure right here, I'm not going to expect you to know. I mean, except for your project, of course. But your project, if you're going to do, I'm going to expect you to do a little bit of research on, on the specific blood vessels that you're doing your project on. But for this class, in terms of the lectures, nothing really beyond this. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Prem, Zala, do you have any final questions?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, so I was just figuring out something. There was something wrong with my mic. So when you talk about efficiency of the heart, does it mean that you're talking about the volume of the blood flowing through the veins? Is that it?
Yes, yeah. So there's a few metrics for efficiency actually, and so the one that gets used a lot is something called ejection fraction. Right, and so that's it's called EF for short. Okay, and so what the ejection fraction measures is the every time your left ventricle contracts, it's going to eject some blood into the body. And so the ejection fraction is the percentage of the left ventricle volume that actually gets ejected in each pump, right?
Mhm.
And so a healthy ejection fraction is usually something north of like 60-70%. And so that means that 70% of the blood inside the ventricle actually leaves the heart. And that's usually pretty efficient. But if someone's having a very inefficient heart, then their ejection fraction might be down near like 40%, or like I've used like 30-20%, something like that. So that's a good measure of efficiency. Another measure, so ejection fraction is basically like a ratio, you can think of it. And so it's like, total volume of the left ventricle underneath, blood that comes out. The other metric for efficiency is something called stroke volume. And so stroke volume is literally the volume of blood that comes out in one stroke. And so stroke volume usually has units of milliliters. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that in turn means that like the amount of oxygen that it carries, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And there's degree of oxygenation too. And so doctor can also measure, out of the blood that actually comes out of your heart, how saturated is it with oxygen? So it's called oxygen saturation. Yeah. So there's lots of different metrics. And so it's there's doctors are looking at a ton of different things at the same time. And there's probably a lot more that I'm forgetting too, but I know these are three main ones that doctors look at to see how efficient your cardiovascular system is.
Yeah, that's what I was looking for, oxygen saturation, because we've been hearing about it a lot lately due to COVID.
I see. Oh yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
All right. So thank you, Professor.
Yep.
Have a nice weekend.
Thanks, you too.